When Emily tasted the gravy she had prepared almost by instinct, Richard dropped his fork. That flavor. Nobody in the world knew how to make that recipe. His 85-year-old grandmother was the last person alive who held the secret. And the housekeeper he'd hired just 2 weeks ago hadn't even heard of it. The aroma wafting from the white marble kitchen wasn't normal. It was something Richard Sterling hadn't smelled since his childhood, when his grandmother still cooked at the old family estate. A scent that dredged up memories so profound they almost hurt. A scent that, according to family law, had existed since 1650. Richard was a 38-year-old man who had built a business empire based on logic and numbers. He didn't believe in coincidences. He didn't believe in destiny. And he definitely didn't believe in soulmate stories that his grandmother had insisted on telling him since he was a boy. But what was happening in his kitchen right then defied all rational explanation. Emily had arrived at his mansion exactly 14 days ago, a 29-year-old woman with honey-colored eyes and hands that trembled when she signed her employment contract. She needed the job desperately. Her grandmother was sick, and the medicine cost more than she could afford. Richard had hired her almost without looking, as he did with all the household staff. But something changed that morning. The head chef had called in sick, and Emily had volunteered to prepare something simple for breakfast. Richard had agreed without thinking, a mistake that would change his life forever. If you've ever felt you knew someone you just met, if you've ever tasted something that transported you to a place you can't explain, then you know what I'm talking about. That feeling that something bigger is operating behind the apparent coincidences. Richard entered the kitchen, following the scent. Emily was standing with her back to him, stirring something in a copper pot she'd found in the basement. She was wearing her navy blue uniform with the white apron, but in that moment, under the morning light streaming through the large windows, she looked like someone else. She looked like someone who belonged to another time. She didn't hear him come in. She was focused on what she was doing, adding ingredients she took from old jars he'd never seen in his own pantry, herbs he didn't recognize, spices that smelled like history, movements that seemed rehearsed for centuries. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, observing. Something inside him awakened, something that had been dormant his entire life, a feeling of recognition so profound, it took his breath away. Emily finally turned and saw him. For a second, their eyes met, and they both felt something neither could explain, a chill that ran down their spines simultaneously, a moment of connection that transcended any logic. "Mr. Sterling," she said, lowering her gaze, "I'm sorry, I found these ingredients in the basement, and I thought maybe. I don't know why, but I felt I had to use them. I can't explain what I'm doing. My hands just know." Richard didn't respond. He approached the pot slowly and looked inside. The liquid was a deep amber color, with small bubbles rising as if they contained ancient secrets. The smell was unmistakable now. It was the Sterling family recipe, the recipe his family had guarded since nearly 400 years, and this housekeeper he'd hired out of necessity, who had no connection to his family, who came from a low-income neighborhood across town, was preparing it perfectly, without a recipe, without instructions, just with her hands. And something she called instinct. Richard picked up a spoon and tasted it, the moment the flavor touched his tongue. His eyes filled with tears. It was exactly the same. Every note, every nuance, every secret his grandmother had guarded jealously for decades. Emily watched him, uncomprehending. "Sir, are you all right? Did I do something wrong?" Richard shook his head, unable to speak. He placed the spoon on the marble and left the kitchen without a word. He needed to call his grandmother. He needed to understand what was happening, because what he had just tasted wasn't possible. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling was 85 years old and possessed a memory that defied her age. When Richard called her that morning, she was at her usual residence, a small house on the outskirts of town where she had decided to spend her final years in peace. "Grandmother," Richard said with a trembling voice, "I need you to come to my house, now." It's urgent." Mrs. Sterling knew her grandson. She knew he was a man who never exaggerated, who never showed emotion, who controlled every aspect of his life with mathematical precision. If he was calling her like this, something extraordinary was happening. An hour later, the elderly woman entered her grandson's mansion, leaning on her cane. Richard waited for her at the door. With an expression she hadn't seen on his face since he was a little boy, a mixture of confusion, fear, and something else, something that resembled hope. He led her directly to the kitchen. Emily was still there, now serving the contents of the pot into small china plates she'd found in a display cabinet. When she saw the elderly woman enter, she stopped and lowered her head respectfully. Mrs. Sterling walked slowly towards the housekeeper. She looked her up and down, studied her face, her hands, the way she held the ladle. And then something changed in the elderly woman's expression. Her eyes, which had seen nearly a century of life, widened as if she were seeing a ghost. Without a word, she took one of the plates and brought it to her nose. She inhaled deeply. Her hands began to tremble so violently that Richard had to hold the plate for her. She tasted it, a single bite. And then Mrs. Sterling dropped the plate to the floor, where it shattered into 1,000 pieces, scattering the ancestral gravy across the white marble. Emily took a step back, frightened. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to," she began to say. But the elderly woman interrupted her. "Who taught you this?" Mrs. Sterling asked, with a voice that trembled with emotion. "Who gave you the recipe?" "No one," Emily replied, increasingly confused. I don't know how to explain it. I found the ingredients, and my hands just knew what to do. It's as if I've done it before. But I know that's impossible because I've never cooked anything like this in my life." Mrs. Sterling sat down heavily in a chair. She looked at her grandson with eyes full of tears. "Richard," she said slowly, "this recipe, this exact recipe, I've kept secret my entire life. My mother taught it to me, and her mother to her, and so on for generations, since 1650. Richard nodded. "I know, grandmother. That's why I called you." The elderly woman continued, her voice barely a whisper. "There are 47 ingredients. 47. Some of them don't even exist anymore. The substitutes we use are just approximations. But Emily," she pointed at Emily, "she used the originals. She found them in the basement, you say. Ingredients that I hid there 50 years ago, thinking no one would ever find them." Emily felt the world spin around her. She didn't understand any of what was happening. She had only wanted to make something for breakfast. She had just followed an impulse she couldn't explain. "Mrs. Eleanor," she said in a small voice, "I swear I didn't know. I had never seen those ingredients before. But when I saw them, it was as if something inside me recognized them, like my hands knew exactly what to do with each of them." Mrs. Eleanor Sterling rose and walked toward Emily. She took her hands and studied them. Working hands. Hands that had known hard labor. Hands that didn't belong to any noble family or have professional culinary training. And yet, "Turn your hands over," the old woman commanded. Emily obeyed, showing her palms upwards. What Mrs. Eleanor Sterling saw made her step back. On Emily's left wrist was a birthmark, a mark with an irregular shape, as if the skin had been burned and healed imperfectly. A mark exactly the same as the one described in the family journal from 1650. Richard Sterling came closer to see. "What is it, grandmother? What does that mark mean?" Mrs. Eleanor Sterling looked at him with eyes that held 400 years of family history. "There's something I never told you, Richard, about the origin of this recipe, about the woman who created it." Emily listened without understanding. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. Something was happening, something that went beyond a simple recipe or a birthmark. If this story is touching something inside you, if you feel there are connections in your life that you can't explain, then you know why it's important to keep listening. Because what Mrs. Eleanor was about to reveal would change everything, the elderly woman asked them to sit down. What she was about to tell required time and preparation. It was a story she had kept almost her entire life, waiting for the right moment. And that moment, inexplicably, had arrived that morning in a white marble kitchen. In 1650, began Mrs. Eleanor Sterling. The Sterling family wasn't what it is now. We weren't exactly nobles. My ancestor, the one who started all this, was the illegitimate son of the governor of the colony. Richard knew part of this story, but never in such detail. His grandmother had never wanted to talk about the family past with such depth. His name was Frederick, the elderly woman continued. Frederick Sterling, though he gave himself the last name. The governor never officially recognized him. Frederick grew up in the shadows of the governor's mansion, seeing the opulence without being able to touch it, knowing he had noble blood, but being treated like a servant. Emily listened, fascinated. For some reason, every word the old woman spoke resonated within her, as if she had already heard it before. And there was a woman, continued Mrs. Eleanor Sterling, lowering her voice as if sharing a sacred secret. The cook of the mansion, a young woman of humble origins, but with an extraordinary gift. She could create flavors that no one else could replicate. She combined ingredients in a way that defied all logic, but that resulted in absolute perfection. Richard looked at Emily. The coincidence was too obvious to ignore. Frederick fell in love with her, continued the elderly woman. A forbidden love in every sense. He was, although illegitimate, of the governor's blood. She was a simple cook. The society of the time would never have allowed that union. But love doesn't understand social classes, does it? It doesn't understand rules imposed by men who believe they can control human hearts. They loved each other in secret for years. She cooked special recipes for him that only he tasted. And he promised her that one day, when he had enough power, he would take her out of the kitchen and make her his wife. Emily felt a lump in her throat. Without knowing why, her eyes filled with tears. But then tragedy struck, said Mrs. Eleanor Sterling, and her voice cracked. Someone discovered their relationship. Someone with envy. And they accused her of witchcraft. Richard held his breath. Witchcraft was a mortal accusation in that era. They said her recipes were the work of the devil, that she used black magic to create those flavors, that she had bewitched the governor's son. They arrested her. They tortured her. And finally, they condemned her to be burned at the stake. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Only the ticking of an antique clock on the wall could be heard. Frederick tried to save her, continued the elderly woman, but it was too late. When he arrived at the square where they were going to burn her, the fire had already started. He threw himself into the flames, trying to free her, and he died with her, embracing her as the fire consumed them both. Emily raised her hand to her left wrist, touching her birthmark without realizing it. Tears streamed down her cheeks without her being able to stop them. But before dying, said Mrs. Eleanor Sterling, looking directly at Emily, she made a promise. She told Frederick that they would meet again, that in another life she would return, and that he would recognize her by the taste. Time seemed to stand still. Richard looked at Emily, and for the first time, he really saw her. Not as the employee he had hired, not as a stranger in his house. He saw her as something more, someone that maybe, just maybe, he had been waiting to find his whole life without knowing it. The cook of the mansion was called Emily, said Mrs. Eleanor Sterling finally, Emily de Los Angeles, and she had a mark on her left wrist, a mark from when she was a child and burned herself with boiling oil. A mark. The old woman pointed to the employee's wrist, exactly like that. Emily looked at her own mark. She had had it her whole life. She always thought it was just a birthmark. Her parents never knew how to explain its origin. She had simply been born with it, but now, in that white marble kitchen, surrounded by a recipe that she had never learned, but that her hands knew how to prepare perfectly, The explanation was beginning to take shape. An impossible explanation. An explanation that defied everything she thought she knew about the world. "This is impossible," said Richard, although his voice lacked conviction. "Reincarnation, soulmates. They're just stories. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling looked at him sadly. "I thought so too, Richard, until today. But how do you explain that this woman, who'd never seen our kitchen, never heard of our family, prepared a gravy recipe that only I know, with ingredients that only I know where to find, made in the exact way it was made 400 years ago?" Richard had no answer. "There's more," the grandmother said. "Much more. But I need to show you something first." She stood up and asked to be taken to the basement. The same basement where Emily had found the ingredients. There, amidst dusty boxes and forgotten memories. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling searched for something specific. After several minutes, she found what she was looking for, an antique wooden box, closed with a rusty padlock. She opened it with a key she'd worn around her neck for decades. Inside was a book, a leather-bound journal, that was crumbling at the edges. The pages were yellowed with time, but the writing was still legible. "This journal," Mrs. Sterling explained, "belonged to Frederick Sterling. He wrote it himself. And what it contains, well, you'll see for yourself." Richard took the journal carefully. He opened it to a page, marked with a faded red ribbon. And what he saw there froze his blood. A drawing. A hand-drawn portrait of a young woman. A woman with almond-shaped, honey-colored eyes, dark hair pulled back under a white cap, and a smile that held secrets from another ERA. It was Emily. Exactly Emily. Not someone who looked like her. Not a coincidence of features. It was her. Drawn almost 400 years ago, in the pages of a journal that no one had opened in decades. Richard dropped the journal. His hands were trembling, just like his grandmother's when she tasted the gravy. Emily approached and looked at the drawing. What she saw left her speechless. It was her reflection, literally her reflection, in a mirror of paper and ink. Every line of her face and every curve of her lips, every expression in her eyes. "It can't be," she whispered. "This can't be real." But it was real as the mark on her wrist, as real as the taste of the gravy that her hands had prepared without instruction, as real as the connection she'd felt with Richard from the moment she started working at that estate. Richard read aloud the words written under the drawing, the voice of a man who had lived 400 years ago, but whose words seemed directed directly to that moment. "My beloved Emily of the Angels, the woman who works magic with her hands, the woman who conquered my heart with a taste. I promise you, I will find you, in this life or the next. I will seek you in every face. I will recognize you in every flavor. And when we finally meet again, nothing and no one will ever separate us." The words hung in the air of the dusty basement. Three people united by a secret of centuries. A love story that had transcended death itself. Mrs. Sterling broke the silence. "Now you understand, Richard. Now you understand why I always told you the stories of Frederick and his cook, because deep down, I always knew this would happen someday, that she would return." Emily's promise wasn't a fairy tale. It was an oath. And oaths of true love, Richard, are not broken, not even by death. Richard looked at the woman he'd hired as a housekeeper, the woman who slept in a small servant's room, the woman whose grandmother was sick and needed expensive medicine, the woman who, according to everything he was discovering, could be the soulmate his ancestor had loved and lost almost 4 centuries ago. "What does all this mean?" Emily asked, in a broken voice. "What am I supposed to do with this information?" Mrs. Sterling walked towards her and took both of her hands. "What you must do, my dear, is remember. Remember who you were. Remember the love you shared. Remember the promise you made." "But I don't remember anything," Emily said while frustrated. "I only know how to cook that gravy without knowing how. I only have this mark, that I always thought was a simple birthmark. That doesn't mean I am that woman." "Maybe not now," the old woman said, "but the memories are there. Emily, somewhere inside of you. This gravy is proof of it. Your soul remembers what your mind has forgotten." Richard remained silent, processing everything. He was a businessman, accustomed to data and figures, not stories of reincarnation and soulmates. But what he'd seen today couldn't be explained with business logic. "There's more," he said finally. "There has to be more evidence. This is too important to rely only on a gravy and a drawing." Mrs. Sterling nodded. "There is more. Much more. But first, I need Emily to do something. I need her to trust me." Emily looked at her cautiously. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to go back to that kitchen and cook something else. Whatever your hands want to make, don't think. Just let your hands guide you. If my suspicions are correct, you don't just know that gravy. You know all the recipes of our family." It was a test that would define everything that would come after. If Emily was really the reincarnation of the estate's cook, she could prepare any ancestral Sterling family recipe without ever having seen it before. Richard and his grandmother waited in the library, while Emily returned to the white marble kitchen. 30 minutes passed. 45. A full hour. The aroma that began to fill the estate was different from the previous one, but equally recognizable to Mrs. Sterling. Her eyes filled with tears. Again. "It's the dessert," she whispered to her grandson. "The dessert my mother made at Christmas, the recipe. I lost when she died, because she never wrote it down. I thought it was gone forever." When they entered the kitchen, Emily was putting the finishing touches on an elaborate dessert that looked like it was from another century. Layers of cream, candied fruits, spices that Richard didn't even know existed, all arranged with an artistic precision that no modern cook could replicate. "I did it," Emily said, but her voice was strange. She was almost in a trance. I don't know how I did it. My hands were moving on their own, and while I was cooking, I had visions." "What visions?" Richard asked, approaching. Emily looked him directly in the eyes, and in that moment, something shifted between them. They were no longer employer and employee. They were two souls, recognizing each other through time. "I saw you," she said slowly. "I saw you. But you were dressed differently. Clothes from another era. And you were looking at me like you're looking at me now. And I was cooking for you. Only for you. Because you were the only one who understood my flavors. The only one who saw beyond the food." Richard felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. It was exactly what Frederick's journal described, exactly what her ancestor had written 400 years ago. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling tasted the gravy. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them, there was peace in them, a peace that only comes from seeing the closure of a cycle that has waited generations. "It's exactly the same," she confirmed. "Exactly the same as my mother made, the one her mother taught her, and her mother's mother, all the way back to the original cook at the estate." 3 perfect gravies. 3 tests that no coincidence could explain. Emily wasn't simply a talented employee with hidden potential. She was something much deeper, much more mysterious, much more beautiful. But that was only the beginning. What would come next would test everything they thought they knew about love, fate, and the power of promises made 400 years ago. Because there was one more secret. A secret that not even Mrs. Eleanor Sterling fully knew. A secret hidden in the pages of Fernando Sterling's diary that no one had read to the end. And that secret was about to be revealed. Richard spent the next few hours locked in the library, reading Fernando Sterling's diary from beginning to end. Each page contained more details about the forbidden love between the illegitimate son of the governor and the cook at the Swanton estate. Fernando described Emily with a devotion that transcended the romantic. To him, she wasn't simply a beautiful woman. She was the personification of a love that makes life worth living. The only person who saw him as a whole human being, not as the illegitimate son everyone despised. She nourishes my soul. Fernando had written, not just my body. Each dish she prepares contains her love. I can taste it in every bite. And when she looks at me, when her honey eyes meet mine, I feel that I finally belong somewhere. I belong to her. Richard read these words and couldn't help but think of Emily, of the way she had looked during the culinary test, of the inexplicable connection he had felt from the first day he hired her. In the last pages of the diary, Fernando had written something different. It was no longer romantic prose. It was a kind of spiritual testament. If anyone reads these words after I am gone, I want them to know that true love doesn't die with the body. The soul remembers. The soul always remembers. And Emily promised to return. Promised that she would find me in another life, another time, and that her hands would prepare me. The same gravy that made me the happiest man in the world today. When that happens, when she returns and cooks without knowing how, you will know that her promise has been fulfilled, and I will be there, in some form, in some body, waiting for her. Because soulmates always find each other, no matter how many lives it takes, no matter how many obstacles they face. The universe conspires to reunite them, and when it finally does, nothing can separate them. Look in St. Michael's Church. There we married in secret. There I left proof of our love, see? And there, when Emily returns, you must take her so that she remembers completely. Richard closed the diary. St. Michael's Church. He knew that name. It was a colonial church in the historic downtown area, one of the few structures that had survived the centuries since colonial times. Without a second thought, he went to find Emily. He found her in the garden, sitting on a bench under a centuries-old tree. She seemed lost in her thoughts, unconsciously touching the mark on her wrist. "Emily," Richard said, approaching, "I need you to come with me." She looked at him with tired eyes. "Where to?" "To St. Michael's Church. There's something we need to find there." For a moment, Emily considered refusing. This was all too much, too impossible, too much for a simple housemaid who only wanted to earn money for her grandmother's medicine. But something in Richard's eyes convinced her, something she recognized without knowing why, something that made her get up and follow him without asking any more questions. The trip to the historic downtown took an hour in the afternoon. Traffic, throughout the entire way, neither of them spoke. The silence was charged with anticipation, unanswered questions, the possibilities that neither dared to name. St. Michael's Church was smaller than Richard remembered, a colonial structure of white stone, with twin steeples that rose toward the cloudy sky. It had been restored several times over the centuries, but it retained its original essence. When Emily got out of the car and saw the church, she stopped dead in her tracks. "I know this place," she whispered. I've been here before." Richard took her arm. "That's impossible. You've never come to the historic downtown." But Emily shook her head. "Not in this life. But I know it. I know exactly what it looks like inside. I know there's an altar with carved wooden saints. I know there's a stained glass window with angels that lets in multicolored light. I know that in the confessional. On the left, there's a loose board where we hid, and where we hid. She stopped, surprised by her own words. Richard felt the hair on his arms stand on end. "What did you hide?" he asked in a hoarse voice. "I don't know," Emily replied. "The words just came out like the gravies, like everything that's happening." There was only one way to find out. They entered the church. The interior was exactly as Emily had described. The altar with wooden saints, the stained glass window with angels, the multicolored light that filtered through the ancient glass. Everything was there, precisely as she had seen it in her mind, without ever having seen it with her eyes. Emily walked toward the confessional on the left, as if she were being guided by an invisible force. Richard followed her in silence, his heart beating so hard he could feel it in his throat. She knelt next to the confessional and searched under the wooden bench. Her fingers found what they were looking for, a slightly loose board that no one would have noticed unless they knew exactly where to look. She lifted it, and underneath, protected from the elements by the dry and dark space, there was something. Richard knelt beside her to see better. It was a small metal box, rusted but intact. Emily took it out with trembling hands and opened it. Inside, there were 2 gold rings joined by a cord, and beneath them, a folded piece of paper that looked about to crumble. With extreme care, Emily unfolded the paper. The ink was faded, but it could still be read. "In this sacred place, and we unite in marriage before God and the holy angels, Fernando Sterling and Emily of the Angels, we promise to love each other in this life and in all that are to come. We promise to find each other again and again, until time itself ceases to exist. This is our eternal vow," below 2 signatures, and below the signatures, one more line: "When she returns, she will bear the mark on her left wrist, and he will recognize her by the flavor she creates. Thus, the promise shall be fulfilled." Emily dropped the paper. Tears streamed down her face, uncontrollable. They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of finally understanding something she had been seeking her entire life, without even knowing it. And then, suddenly, she remembered everything. The memories hit her like a tsunami. Images, sounds, smells, sensations. 400 years of oblivion collapsing in a single, devastating instant. She saw the kitchen of the palace, felt the heat of the stone ovens, smelled the spices she mixed with love, and she saw Frederick, young, passionate, looking at her with eyes that held all the love in the world. She saw the nights they escaped to be together, the stolen kisses in dark hallways, the promises whispered in her ear, the day he gave her the ring and they vowed to love each other forever. And she saw the end, the town square, the crowd shouting, the flames rising, Frederick running towards her, his arms around her as the fire consumed them, and his last words. "I will find you," Emily screamed, a scream that held 400 years of pain and love and loss. And now, finally, reunion. Richard held her as she trembled. He didn't understand exactly what was happening, but he knew it was real. More real than anything he had ever experienced in his life. "I remember you," Emily sobbed. "Frederick, I remember you." When Emily called him Frederick, something awakened in Richard too, as if that name had unlocked something deep within his own soul. Memories that weren't his, but were at the same time. Feelings he didn't remember feeling, but that he recognized as his own. He began to cry too. He didn't know why exactly. He just knew that this moment was the most important of his existence. That everything he had done in his life, all the business deals, all the wealth, all the success, had been just a waiting game. A waiting game for this moment. For her. "I found you," he whispered. "After all this time, I finally found you." They remained embraced in that old church, surrounded by ghosts of another century, and promises that had survived death. Time seemed to stand still, honoring a reunion 400 years in the making. When they finally separated, Emily took the 2 rings from the box. She looked at them for a long moment, and then she did something that neither of them expected. She took off her right shoe and reached inside. She pulled out a small gold ring that she had kept hidden since she had a memory. "My grandmother gave it to me," she explained in a trembling voice. "She said it had belonged to my family forever, that I should always keep it with me. I never knew why." She placed her ring next to the other 2. All 3 were identical, 3 rings from the same era, the same design, the same ancient gold. Richard understood then. Emily's grandmother was also part of this story. Somehow, through generations, the knowledge had survived, fragments of memory passed from mother to daughter, waiting for the moment of reunion. "We need to go see your grandmother," Richard said. "She knows more than she's let on." The hospital where Emily's grandmother was staying was small and unassuming, very different from the private clinics that Richard frequented. But when they entered the room, everything else ceased to matter. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling was 92 years old. She was connected to machines that monitored her weak heart. But when she saw Emily enter with Richard, her eyes lit up with a surprising clarity. "Finally," the old woman whispered, "you finally found him." Emily rushed to her side. "Grandmother, why didn't you ever tell me? Why didn't you ever tell me about the rings and about the recipe? About all of this?" Mrs. Eleanor Sterling smiled weakly. "Because you wouldn't have believed me, my dear. You had to live it. You had to remember it for yourself." She turned to Richard, studying him with eyes that had seen almost a century of life. "And you are Mr. Sterling. I knew it the moment I saw you on television years ago. You have the same eyes as the portrait that my great-grandmother kept." Richard approached the bed. "Mrs. Sterling, what do you know about all this?" "I know what my mother told me." "Who told her mother? Who told her mother?" "The story of 2 lovers who promised to find each other in another life. The woman would return with the mark of fire on her wrist. The man would recognize her by her cooking." She paused to catch her breath. The machines beeped softly. "And I know something else, something that no one else knows. The reason why Emily was born with the gift of cooking without learning, the reason why her soul never forgot." "What reason?" Emily asked. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling took her granddaughter's hand and squeezed it with all the strength she had left. "When Emily of the Angels died in that bonfire 400 years ago, she was pregnant. Pregnant with Frederick's child, a child who was never born in that life. But the soul of that child also made a promise. He promised to reunite his parents. He promised that when Emily returned, he would be there to guide her." Emily felt a chill run through her body. "And that child?" she asked in a barely audible voice. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling closed her eyes. "That child has also returned. He has been waiting his entire life. And now, finally, his mission is complete." "Who is it?" Richard asked, though something inside him already knew the answer. The old woman opened her eyes one last time. She looked at her granddaughter with infinite love. "That child is me, Richard. I have waited 92 years to see you reunited with your love. I have kept the secrets. I have kept the memory alive. I have prepared the way. And now, I can go in peace." Her words hung in the hospital room as the machines continued their monotonous song. Emily understood then why she had always had such a deep connection with her grandmother. Why Mrs. Eleanor Sterling had always looked at her with a mixture of maternal love and something else, something she now recognized as the love of a son for his mother. "Grandmother," Emily said, weeping, "don't leave me now, not now that I finally understand." Mrs. Eleanor Sterling smiled. "I'm not leaving you, my dear. I'm simply going home, and this time, when I am born again, I can be your son for real, yours and Richard's. She looked at Richard with eyes that contained generations of waiting. Take care of her, she ordered. This time, let nothing separate you. This time, fulfill the life that was denied to you. Richard took the old woman's other hand. I promised, he said, and this time, my promises will be kept. That night, Mrs. Eleanor Sterling passed away peacefully. Her heart finally stopped struggling, releasing her soul for its next journey. Emily and Richard remained by her side until the very end, holding her hands as she crossed over. The days that followed were a mixture of mourning and discovery. Emily arranged her grandmother's funeral with the help of Richard, who insisted on paying all expenses, but beyond the sadness, there was a strange peace in the air, as if Mrs. Eleanor Sterling had fulfilled her mission and now rested satisfied. During the wake, Richard noticed something peculiar. Several elderly people from the low-income neighborhood where Emily had lived approached to pay their respects, and some of them looked at her in a strange way, as if they recognized her from somewhere. One elderly woman in particular, around 80 years old, took Emily's hands and looked her sternly in the eyes. "Your grandmother told us about you," she said in a low voice. "Since you were born, she knew you were special. She said you had eyes from another time." Emily felt a chill. "What else did she tell you?" The elderly woman smiled. "She said that one day, a wealthy man would find you, and that you would recognize him by the hunger in his eyes. Not hunger for food," she said. "Hunger for true love." Richard, who was nearby listening, felt the words hit him directly in the heart, because that was exactly what he had felt when he first saw Emily. An emptiness he didn't know he had, suddenly being filled with her presence. After the funeral, Emily wanted to return to the small apartment where she had lived with her grandmother to collect her things. Richard insisted on accompanying her. The apartment was humble but impeccably clean. 2 small rooms, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom that needed repairs. It was a world completely different from Richard's family estate, but it was filled with love visible in every detail. In Mrs. Eleanor Sterling's room, Emily found a box she had never seen before. It was hidden beneath a loose floorboard, similar to the one in the church confessional. Inside the box were letters, dozens of letters yellowed with time, written in an old English that Emily could barely read. But Richard, who had studied historical documents for his businesses, was able to decipher them. "These letters," he said with amazement, "are from Frederick Sterling. Love letters to Emily of the Angels." But how did they get here? There was a more recent note, written in Mrs. Eleanor Sterling's trembling handwriting. "My dearest granddaughter, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and that you have found your Frederick. These letters have been in our family for generations, passed from mother to daughter in secret. No one knows how they originally came to us, but I always knew they were yours, that they were always yours. Take care of them as I took care of them, and love your Richard as Frederick loved his Emily. This time, let love triumph." The letters told the story from Frederick's perspective, his desperate love for the cook in the mansion, the risks he took to see her, the plans they made to escape together, and finally, the letter he was never able to deliver. The letter he wrote the night before Emily was arrested. "My eternal love, tomorrow. I will get you out of here. I have everything planned. A ship awaits us in Boston Harbor. We will begin a new life far from this city that has treated us with such cruelty. Do not worry about the danger. For you, I would face 1,000 deaths. For you, I would cross oceans and centuries. For you, I would return 1,000 times until I found you again." But the letter never reached its intended recipient. Frederick was too late, and the love they promised was suspended in time, waiting for another opportunity. Now, 400 years later. That opportunity had arrived, but the death of the elderly woman was not an end. It was a new beginning. In the weeks that followed, Richard made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He announced that he would marry Emily, the housekeeper he had hired just a month before. The media exploded with the news. The multimillionaire Richard Sterling, one of the most eligible bachelors in the country, getting engaged to a woman from a low-income neighborhood. Journalists were looking for scandals. High society was murmuring disapprovals. No one understood. But Richard and Emily didn't need anyone to understand. They knew the truth, a truth that transcended social classes, worldly expectations, the opinions of strangers. Richard faced his critics with a calm that no one expected. In a press conference that he organized specifically to address the rumors, he said something that left everyone in silence. "You ask me why I'm marrying Emily. You ask me if it's a scandal, if it's crazy, if I've lost my mind. And my answer is simple. I have spent 38 years searching for something without knowing what it was. I have been successful in business. I have accumulated wealth. I have achieved everything that society considers important. But something was always missing, an emptiness that no achievement could fill." He paused, looking directly at the cameras. "When I met Emily, that emptiness disappeared. Not because she is beautiful, although she is. Not because she is talented, although she is. But because my soul recognized her. And when your soul recognizes someone, it doesn't matter where that person comes from. It doesn't matter how much money they have or don't have. The only thing that matters is not letting them go." The conference ended with unexpected applause from some journalists. And although the critics continued, their voices became weaker and weaker in the face of the evident authenticity of the love that Richard and Emily shared. The night before the wedding, Emily had a dream so vivid that she woke up crying. In the dream, she was in the kitchen of the colonial mansion. She could feel the heat of the ovens, smell the spices she mixed, hear the bustle of the servants around her. And then Frederick entered, young, handsome, with eyes that looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. "Tomorrow," he said, "tomorrow we escape. Tomorrow we begin our life together." But Emily knew, even in the dream, that tomorrow would never come. She knew what came next: the accusations, the arrest, the flames. And then the dream changed. She was no longer in the mansion. She was in the Church of the Holy Angels. And Frederick was no longer Frederick. He was Richard, dressed as a groom, waiting for her at the altar with the same expression of absolute love. "This time," he said to her in the dream, "this time we make it." Emily woke up with tears in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief. 400 years of waiting were about to end. And when the wedding day finally arrived, they chose the only possible place for the ceremony: St. Michael's Church. The very altar where Frederick and Emily Sterling had been secretly married 400 years ago was now adorned with white flowers and golden candles. The same stained glass windows that had witnessed their first marriage allowed the same multicolored light to stream upon their second. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling, Richard's grandmother, was the matron of honor. At 85 years old, she walked down the aisle with more strength than she had shown in decades. Her eyes sparkled with tears of joy. As she watched the family prophecy she had awaited her entire life come to fruition. When the priest asked if there was anyone who objected to the union, the silence in the church was absolute. Not even the ghosts of the past had any objections. This marriage had been written in the stars 4 centuries ago. And when Richard placed the ring on Emily's finger, he used one of the original rings, the same ring that Frederick had placed on his beloved's finger in 1650. The circle finally closed. "I loved you then," Richard said, holding Emily's hands in his. "I love you now, and I will love you in every life to come." Emily smiled through her tears. "And I will always recognize you, by the taste, by the touch, by the way my soul illuminates when you're near." The kiss they shared sealed not only a marriage, but a promise fulfilled across the centuries. 400 years of waiting, culminating in a perfect moment. As they left the church as husband and wife, the sun broke through the clouds and bathed them in golden light, as if the universe itself celebrated this reunion, as if Frederick and the first Emily, and wherever they were, could finally rest in peace. A year later, their first child was born, a boy with wise eyes that seemed to hold memories of other lives. They named him Michael, in honor of the church where everything had been revealed, and in honor of Emily of the Angels. Mrs. Eleanor had the privilege of meeting him before she passed, when she held the baby in her arms. Something in the child's eyes made her smile. "Welcome back," she whispered. "This time, you can stay." The baby looked at her, as if he understood perfectly. 2 months later, Mrs. Eleanor Sterling died peacefully, surrounded by her family. Her last wish was to be buried with Frederick's journal, so she could return it to its original owner, on the other side. And so, the story of Frederick Sterling and Emily of the Angels came to its true end. Not in the flames of a pyre in 1650, but in the renewed love of their reincarnations in the 21st century. Some people will say this is just a story, that reincarnation is a myth, that soulmates don't exist. But for those who have felt that inexplicable connection with someone they just met, for those who have tasted a flavor, that transported them to a place they can't name, for those who carry marks on their body, whose origin they can't explain, for them, this story is more than a tale. It's a promise that true love always finds a way, no matter how many lives it takes, no matter how many obstacles it faces. True love transcends time, death, and social barriers. Emily now cooks in a kitchen that is her own, not as an employee, but as the lady of the house. The ancestral gravy recipe continues to be prepared, now by hands that remember not only how to make it, but why they make it. Every Sunday, the family gathers to share that special meal. Little Michael, now 3 years old, already shows a particular interest in the kitchen. He likes to sit in his high chair and watch his mother as she prepares the dishes. His wise eyes follow every movement, as if he's learning something he already knows. Richard has changed too. He is no longer the cold, calculating businessman he was before he met Emily. Now he smiles more. He delegates more work. He spends entire afternoons in the garden with his son, telling him stories of ancestors who lived 400 years ago. And when night falls, when Michael is already asleep, and the estate falls silent, Richard and Emily sit in the library. He reads aloud Frederick's letters, while she prepares tea with herbs from the ancestral recipe. The words of love written centuries ago sound fresh, current, eternal. Sometimes, Emily has visions, fragments of that past life, that return without warning. Moments of happiness in the palace kitchen, stolen kisses in dark hallways, and also at inevitably, the end, the flames, Frederick's embrace, the heat that consumed them, as they promised to find each other again. But now, when those visions arrive, they no longer scare her. She receives them as what they are, reminders of a love that was strong enough to traverse death itself. Richard also has his moments. There are nights when he wakes up startled, with the echo of screams in his ears and the smell of smoke in his nose. In those moments, he seeks Emily at his side, touches her warm skin, listens to her quiet breathing. And he knows that this time is different. This time, the fire will not reach them, because some promises are stronger than time, some souls are more stubborn than fate, and some loves simply refuse to die. Every time the aroma fills the estate, Richard smiles. Because he knows that taste is more than ingredients mixed with mastery. It's love. Love that has survived centuries. Love that died in the flames and was reborn from the ashes. Love that proved to be stronger than death itself. If this story touched something in you, if you felt resonance with some part of what you heard, maybe it's because you too have ancient promises waiting to be fulfilled. Maybe there's someone in your life whose connection you can't explain. Maybe there are flavors, places, or sensations that transport you to memories you don't remember having lived. Don't ignore those signs. The universe is constantly speaking to us. We just need to learn how to listen. Leave a comment telling us if you've ever felt an inexplicable connection with someone. If you've recognized someone you just met. If you've known how to do something without anyone teaching you. Because maybe, just maybe, your own story of reincarnation is waiting to be discovered. And when that happens, when you finally recognize your soulmate, remember the words of Frederick Sterling, written 400 years ago. Soulmates always find each other, no matter how many lives it takes, no matter how many obstacles they face. The universe conspires to reunite them, and when she finally does, nothing can tear them apart. This was the story of Richard and Emily, the story of Fernando and Emily Sterling, a love that refused to die. Until the next story, until the next reunion of soulmates.